Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I'm your host, James Mackey. I'm really excited for today's episode. I have a couple guests joining us today, and there's a lot of really great topics we're going to be discussing. When to hire a VP of people, really understanding how HR is tying back what they're doing, hiring plans and whatnot to North Star metrics. And we're going to think about operational excellence and a lot of topics that I think all three of us are very passionate about. So let me go ahead and introduce our guests. We have Austin Ogilvie. Austin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
For sure. And Joe Bast as well. Joe, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So Austin, before we jump into it, let's do some quick introductions. Austin, could you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So currently I'm a co-founder and executive chairman of a digital compliance company called Thoropass. We essentially help predominantly software companies meet the eclectic mixed bag of digital security and privacy frameworks out there. So think SOC 2, high trust, ISO, enterprise vendor assessments, et cetera. So our platform streamlines the collection of all of the digital exhaust that's relevant in those compliance contexts and makes it super easy to get audited for those different standards. Before Thoropass, I founded another startup company called YHAT. It was a data science platform, which ultimately we sold to a bigger data science company called Ultrix. And what else can I tell you? But before that, I was working for a small business lending startup called On Deck. And before that, I was in college. So
yeah, and you also are big into kayaking, right?
Yes. All adventure sports, anything fast and dangerous, but kayaking especially, yes.
Anything that can kill you, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah, that stuff's wild. I started looking into kayaking after we talked about it. And
yeah.
Dude, that's intense. Like I think I want to get into it, but it's a whole thing. Lots to learn.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get out on over by Great Falls, you know.
I'm right here. Plenty of opportunities, but don't people literally die out there every year?
I mean, you have to pick the right rivers, but
right. Yeah, that's the thing.
That's a different podcast episode.
Yeah, I don't know how to pick the right rivers. That's the issue. We'll get there. But anyways, Joe Bast, welcome to the show. Could you give a little bit of insight on your background as well?
Sure. Hi, my name is Joe Bast. I'm the VP of People and Operations at Thoropass. I've been there for about 2.5 years. As Austin said, we're a compliance platform helping mainly software companies get ready for and get compliant so they can grow their businesses. When I joined Thoropass, we were about 40 people, and as of this week, we're 194. So over the last 2.5 years, we've experienced some pretty substantial growth. Prior to Thoropass, I headed up people functions at similar startups, usually Series A or B, starting with a couple dozen people, and then either had an exit when we were 500 people or left that business when we were over 1,000. So prior to those startups, headed up learning functions for a couple of Fortune 500 companies. And educationally, I'm a psychologist. So my background's organizational psychology, and really got into this line of work because I wanted to help create a great place for people to spend the 8 to 10 hours to 12 hours a day that they spend, so that when they go home, they can enjoy the rest of their lives because their work's going great.
So Joe, that's really interesting, your psychology background. I wonder if after we hit record on the show, or actually when we finish the show is what I mean, if there are a few links on different theories or different, I don't know, just different things that you studied that were really light bulb moments or have highly influenced how you do your work and help teams scale and develop. So I think that would be great. And then we could drop it in the podcast description for folks.
Sure, love it.
Yeah, cool. By the way, when I talk about stuff
James,
like this, guys,
you and I share a worldview. Like that's among the first things I wanted to ask Joe when I first met him. It's like, what did you study? What did you research? Send me the links.
I love it. I'm a huge psychology nerd as well. I love anything psychology, philosophy, science. Like I'm just all for it.
Totally intellectually, but also like this is an applied science. You know, this actually is very real world applicable. This not that I'm allergic to just the intellectual curiosities of human psychology, but it's always more interesting when it's in the real world, and like this very much.
I think so.
Kind is very real.
And what's interesting too is like I think a lot of people think that like psychology is like this loosely based thing that isn't necessarily like a science. It doesn't follow the scientific method, and it's total BS. Like there's double blind testing for all sorts of theories out there. And you know what's interesting is a lot of the most well-known theories have actually been proven false in psychology,
Yeah.
but like those are the ones that everybody like seems to, the ones that people know about. It's kind of weird.
Right. That's why the designation gets that kind of suspicion. Is like some of it has been bullshit in the past. Like there's a serious replication crisis in like clinical psychology and psychiatry, but there is not in industrial. Like
Correct.
industrial is far, it's like art is to design or something. Like design is more applied than art. And I feel there is a similar thing here.
Made the mistake or choice to go to an engineering school for my PhD. So I went to the Illinois Institute of Technology, which meant that this was a real science. And which was great. Like I got really deep in statistics and reviewing empirical research. But my dissertation was actually on the prediction of leadership effectiveness for a group of leaders. So I had a client, they had 1,000 different general managers in different variety of functions. And it was to try to predict who was going to be more effective based on either intelligence or experience or a set of personality factors. And so I actually had a chance to survey them all, administer all their intelligence tests, all their experience checklists, the personality tests, and then compare them and their effectiveness and their relative conditions. Client was Waste Management. I was a consultant at the time. And so Waste Management, the large garbage company out of Chicago. And this is the mid 90s. At the time, recycling was fairly new and landfill business was really old school. And what we found, which was predicted in the literature, was that people who were highly experienced would do better in the old condition, in the landfill condition, and that people who are highly intelligent would do better in the new condition, the novel condition, which is the recycling condition. What we didn't expect is that people who were both highly intelligent and highly experienced would have a harder time. And the reason they had a harder time was because they needed this personality trait called cognitive flexibility, the ability to choose among your cognitive resources, and in making that choice to match the condition. So if they were in a recycling situation and were cognitively flexible, they knew they could choose their intelligence and create novel solutions and be more effective in the new condition. And if they were in the landfill condition and they were highly experienced or highly intelligent, they could use that cognitive flexibility to choose the experience and follow the heuristics that had been successful and proven in that condition. So this interaction between a cognitive resource and the condition they were facing was the contribution that I made to the science. It was an area that hadn't been studied.
How did you measure the cognitive flexibility? Like what gets you there?
Yeah, so there's a personality inventory that focused on the big five, and one of the dimensions within that was neuroplasticity, and it was that dimension of neuroplasticity that was the interactive predictor between those.
So okay, so how do you really test neuroplasticity? Like, what was just to dig a little deeper on that?
Yeah, it's a series of questions. There's probably 15 questions out of 200 that are things like, when facing a situation, I make a choice on how to approach that situation. The reverse question is, I frequently find myself applying my experience in situations. Or when I face a new situation, I create novel ideas. There's 15 questions or so that if they are more likely and that score is higher, the person's more likely to do that in the real world.
Yeah, that's actually that's fascinating. And I think that would be really interesting for more folks to actually put into their interview process. Are these so like for somebody, what is like for somebody that might be would get neuroplasticity to answer well, what would their answers look like?
I'd be interested in that too. Like, you're a hiring manager, you're not a psychologist, you don't also want to be a weirdo when they interview. What is a reasonable question to ask that kind of gets at that?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. So behavioral questions are the way to do this in interviews in general. And so behavioral questions that get at this would be things like, think about a situation that you were in that has been experienced by a lot of other people's, and it's well known what makes for effectiveness in that situation. Tell me about a time that you had to solve a problem in that situation. What'd you do? And what you want to hear them say, and it's the opposite of what people think they should say in an interview, what you want to hear them say is, I found people who've done this and I asked them what they did. Versus, oh, I looked at the situation and I brainstormed all these ideas and then I tried these things out. Because what happens is in highly researched, well-documented situations, your path to a positive result, the most direct path, is doing the thing that's worked in the past. Like, you don't need to recreate the wheel. Someone who is like trying to dazzle you in an interview, or someone who doesn't have experience, is going to say, oh, I tried this, I tried that, I tried this. And they're going to actually recreate the wheel 16 times and not create a novel solution when you could have had that thing solved in 3 steps.
Yeah, I think it's one of the ways that I've looked at it through my career is like, there are so many things where I don't have to recreate the wheel. And honestly, sometimes I fall in the trap of like wanting to do something hands-on and solve the problem. And then I have to remind myself like, well, wait a second. Why am I there's somebody out there who's done this, and I can learn from them. And I think too, it's like there are things that you want to be innovative about and you want to be forward thinking, but you want to build the foundation as far as it can be built from learning from others. And when you reach that level where you've already done that, then it's like, then use your intellectual curiosity and creativity to jump from there, but you don't just start there from the ground up, right? I mean, that's how I've looked at it.
I'm glad that this came out in the wash, because Joe, we've never actually talked about this precise concept before, but like, there's a reason why every single VC deal I've ever done starts with getting outstanding operators, like the CEOs and CTOs of Flatiron Health and GLG and Plaid and Carta are all on our cap table. And that's not an accident. It's like almost no problems in business or technology turn out to be unique. Every company has at least a few unique problems 100% of the time. There's some, but most problems are not special. And isn't it useful to have, great people who have come before you that tackled whatever the engineering situation you're dealing with is, or whatever the people situation is, and on it goes. Yeah. Like that. So that has definitely been my ethos personally.
So yeah, I love the hard science. So like, this isn't starting at the start of the startup story for people, but it's kind of in the middle. So when you're scaling a startup and you're in HR, there's a point at which you've gone through a hiring curve, and you're maybe halfway to getting that massive bump you need to get all the people and all the sales you need. And you run into the fact that the people that you've hired previously, while very smart and motivated, don't have the experience they need to lead the team above them or to lead the function above them. And there's a point at which you have to make a choice to bring in experienced leaders. It's a really hard choice, because the people that you have, you don't want to demotivate because you're going to put outside people above them. At the same time, your business doesn't have the amount of time to wait that it would take that person to learn the thing that you're going to hire this leader for. And the reason you're going to hire this leader, to Austin's point, is because they've been in other places where they have already solved this, and they're going to bring that experience to bear. And while you do have a fantastic, CSM team lead, you don't have a director of customer experience that's going to put in place what you need so your clients don't churn. That person has never done that. You're not going to put in a director of CX, like you're not going to promote a director of CX that's now going to do a great job of expansion revenue because you promoted the most amazing CSM. Now, that amazing CSM can learn that, maybe not in a vacuum, but the amount of time it's going to take him or her to learn that is longer than your business has. And by the way, those customers 12 months from now are probably going to churn if they don't have someone who's leading that function that knows how to do this and has done it in the past. And so
generally, I completely agree. Like, yes, in startups, I have very little big company experience. So I take my all things I say with a certain grain of salt if your world is big company stuff. But in startups, like, you do have to move quickly, and you don't have time to let everybody grow into the next, liminal phase professionally, in all cases. On the other hand, a lot of startups make the mistake of hiring, like, I'm going to go get the outside ringer executive for this, that, and the other thing. You can bring in outside executives one at a time in a few areas, but it's tremendously risky to hire all outside ringers that are like considerably more senior for a few reasons. It can be alienating, I think, on a personal level, though many people won't express this like consciously, or they won't say that, but it will feel like that, and understandably. And also, the senior folks may not be the weapon that they are in their world, because startups don't have the right plumbing and infrastructure for them to flourish.
And so you nailed it. There's a special other component to this outside experienced leader that you are going to bring in. And there's at least two dimensions to this. Outside their experience that they can bring, they need to be a player coach such that they know how to do the work and they're willing to do the work, to go up to their elbows in the mud, because you're in a startup and they're not going to have the team or the systems or the processes below them to get other people to do it. So you need to find someone who's done it and is still willing to do it. You also need that person to be a fantastic coach and developer, because if they're not coaching the people below them who desperately want to learn this stuff, they're not developing the people below them, they're going to lose them. And so it's a really special profile you're looking for when you bring in outside leaders. And it's hard. It's like sometimes you can really hit it out of the park with the right leader, and sometimes you miss. The better you're at finding that profile, the more likely that person and the function they lead is going to succeed.
It's interesting for my company. We're bootstrapped, right? So it's a bit of a different. It's taken me like quite a while to get where we're at, and so in the grand scheme of things, we're a relatively small company compared, of course, to like enterprise, right? But one of the things that we've done is I built out a board of advisors, not directors, right? I don't have equity. I don't have equity investors, but I still felt like it was important to have some really experienced folks in the room, and so I think one of the value adds that I could see there is for the younger leaders I have within the company, at least they can do advisory calls and level up and kind of follow the strategy outlined for them. And then as we scale, they're going to be able to introduce us hopefully to more leaders as we build out the leadership team further. So it's like more of that back channeled relationship driven approach. And I guess the only silver lining, like hiring great leaders is really hard, but the only silver lining is like you can't back channel for positions at scale. Like you're going to run out of your network. But if you need like a really good key executive, if you have some really great advisors, hopefully they're going to know some folks that they trust that they can refer in, right?
Totally. I think your instincts are very spot on there. Generally, I am suspicious of, there's a lot of like snake oil salesmen and salespeople, a lot of LinkedIn profiles that just say like startup advisor. It's like, I caution founders to be a little skeptical about people that are on the first or second time you've ever met asking for equity. You never get the equity back if you give it to the wrong. I mean, there's basically two ways you can irreparably fuck up your startup. I don't know if you can swear on this podcast, but there's basically only two ways. One is you can give the equity to the wrong investors, the wrong employees. You never get it back. The equity is a one-time thing. You can really annihilate your cap table by mistake if you aren't careful and thoughtful. And like Joe, we've spent a lot of time thinking about equity budgets and stuff, like a lot, because it's precious, and then number two is culture. It's almost impossible to fix a startup if you have ruined the culture. It can be done, but it almost can't be done. It's a very low probability of success. But going back to the advisors thing, in solopreneur or like creator economy, I think you've timed this business perfectly. I mean, to perfection. It's a great moment to do a podcast company like this. Having advisors, in many cases, can be very good way. Like when it's time for you to hire, I don't know who these people are, but like the executive of whatever part of the org you're going to need in the future. It's a very fancy person. It's a very expensive person with a lot going in their world. They need a reason to pay attention to your company and get to know you, because a year or 2 years from now, they're not even going to be able to reasonably consider taking a role within your leadership team if they don't understand what's going on. It's just a very big ask to go to a big professional executive and get them to go to a smaller company, even if they like you and they like the company. It's commercially, it's a very different way to exist in the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for us, it's like, again, it's been 8 years. So the podcast is a separate company. It's a value creation for the tech industry. I'm the CEO of Secure Vision, which is embedded recruiting for the tech industry. And the only reason I was able to get the incredible advisors I have, I mean, these are really, really incredible folks that have built and sold recurring revenue services companies recently, as well as people that have gone through scale from like 0 to 30 million ARR over a period of like 3 years. So these are folks that I handpicked, all of which I've known for years. And nobody's an unknown quantity. These are all folks that have advised me that I just paid a lot per hour, like a lot, right? More than I think a lot of folks would, because I understand I'm not paying for the hour, I'm paying for the 20 years of experience, right? But anyways, like the only way I was able to get them now is like I've worked with over 150 companies, right? I have some really cool, really good logos. I have a lot of a great, like we have a really great reputation for delivering quality. And it's like, it's funny, it's like a recruiting company. I've never gotten out of the recruiting seat. It's just now it's like, it's on the advisory side and, on the podcast side and all these types of things. But yeah, it's, you have to be like, the burden of proving legitimacy falls on the founding and executive team. And I think that like a lot of earlier stage scale ups, like don't necessarily understand that, particularly folks that come from big tech, right? Like they come from Netflix and they're like a product leader there. And then they start a company and they're trying to run like a recruitment hiring process as they did at like with that huge brand and that massive infrastructure. And it's like, you have to prove legitimacy for anybody who's going to interact with your business. They have to be able to see the vision and believe in what you're doing.
Definitely. One of the things Austin said, which I actually think brings us back to the start of the story. One of the easiest or worst ways to mess up your startup is through culture. I think that does bring us back to the start of the startup story. Culture is this thing where you have a founder or a group of founders where they've created something super special. And they're creating something super special, not because they're solving a hard problem or disrupting an interesting industry, but because of the way they're doing it, the way they behave with each other, the way they think, the questions they ask, the way they collaborate. And the early people they bring in are like-minded. So by the time they are 12, 15, or 20 people, they've created this special culture that's all about them because of the way they've interacted. Now they're about to grow. And they want to keep as much as they can that special part of the culture. And so if you then say, okay, culture is not important, we don't care, let's grow at all costs, you're going to diffuse that culture. You're going to completely distribute it, and you're going to end up with some random version of that culture, which you didn't intend, and B, you don't like. And so at that inflection point, at that time at which you're like, okay, we have to scale, we're going to bring a bunch of people into this business, you have to say intentionally, what type of business do we want to create? What are the things that we love about our culture and the way we interact that we want to keep and make sure don't go away? And then what are the things that we might need to let go because they're not going to be usable or possible at scale? And it was at that point that Austin and I actually met. I think Austin and even Sam realized that they were about to grow, and that at that point they wanted to make sure they could keep that special part of the culture. And a lot of our early discussions were about how do you scale culture? How do you make the thing we have great when it's bigger? And that guided a lot of the things we did early on.
Yeah, I think and when I've talked to a lot of startup and scale up founders, that is something that they realize very quickly. Sometimes they don't realize until the culture starts to shift a little bit. And they're like, oh, wait a second.
That's been my experience. My overwhelming experience is that people don't understand that a big fancy VC round goes in, wires hit the bank. You now have to deploy that capital. The VCs, like they need to have these companies ideally deploy the money effectively as fast as possible. They'd love it deployed overnight if every dollar could be actually effectively used instantaneously. But like basically they want you to use it in a year or maybe 2 years per each round. So if you were like, when we met Joe, I can't remember if we had actually closed the B or we were very close to closing it, or it was around our Series B. We had raised 3 million in summer of 2019 and 10 million in the summer of 2020. And then it was a year later and we were raising a much bigger round, $35 million Series B. And it's one thing to deploy $3 million in a year or 18 months. It's even very much possible to do 10 million in a year. So like those rounds, we had perfect, line of sight on the things we would need to do. 35 million is a lot of money, and that's a lot of hires. It's a lot of infrastructure, human infrastructure, technical infrastructure, tooling, all of that stuff. And I don't want to embarrass Joe. I've said this before. I think next to signing the articles of incorporation in the first place in 2019, and like actually just deciding to do this company, the single best business decision we've probably made is hiring Joe when we did. We found a very perfectly calibrated, like Joe has not only seen the movie for the tour of duty that we needed to embark on at that moment, but had like filmed the movie at a few places. And, the movie was bad and the movie was good. And he like going back to the pattern recognition and having familiarity with how to do things, like, boy, aren't we fucking glad that we found somebody who is like commercially minded, because like HR can have a negative stigma, right? Like you attract startup people, they like nimbleness and they like having a lot of responsibility, and there's not a lot of bureaucracy. Well, it's very important to hire a people leader in that moment. I stand by that. And I think a lot of founders make a mistake by not appreciating that. It's way more important than they think. On the other hand, you need to be really, really disciplined in scouting someone who talks out loud about not layering in too much at once. Like, you need to layer in structure into everything in a way that is compatible with people's enthusiasm. And, I don't know, I'm banging on.
Well, yeah, I think the other thing is that VP of people, HR, whatever you choose to call it, the role is a lot wider in scope than I think a lot of people realize. And so getting back to Joe's point earlier about like neuroplasticity is that you really need somebody who is going to pull in different experts, because there's just so much scope. It's doing everything from thinking about the culture to making sure that your process and technology stack is optimized to protecting the company, right? And doing those types of things, and compliance. And there's just so many different things. And it's I'm not going to say it's impossible to be amazing at all of it, but you have to know where your core focus is going to be, and which experts to kind of pull in to help support that infrastructure, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think Austin's point, which I love, I've been an operator most of my life. Like, I grew up as an entrepreneur, and in most of my jobs, I've had a operational component to it. And when coming into Thoropass, some of my very first questions were, what's the business plan? Based on, this recent inflection of cash, what are we going to do with it? And so what do you guys have in mind? Are we growing? Are we going to invest in product people? Are we, going to build something so intricate and fantastic that we need these deep technology experts? Are we going to go out and look for clients? Until we know the business plan, you can't actually go out and build the HR systems. And anyone who then tells you, oh, I don't need that, I've done this before, I'm just going to build HR, with no context, the business plan is actually going to wreck your business. They're going to spend way too much money. They're going to spend time on doing things that are not value added. Many HR people, when they come in and hear the words, hey, we want to scale culture, quickly start creating things like employee resource groups and inclusion programs and all these other engagement things that are fine, but they're not timed appropriately for what the business is trying to do. If you're trying to scale culture and your business plan means you're going to go out and hire a team of AEs or a group of marketing people or build an SDR function, you're not doing employee engagement and inclusion, you're doing recruiting. And if you're going to do recruiting, you're going to diffuse that culture, you need to recruit for some very specific skills. And they include things both that are great about sellers in this example, and things that are great about the culture. One of the things that amazed me as we scaled this, and by the way, when we went to scale, we embedded questions around our culture into the hiring process for every role across the organization. And we had at that point, we were talked about being inclusive collaborators as being one of our values. So we hired for this. When we got the team together for the first time, the entire company in New York City in the fall of 2021, we got the engineers together, and they've been hired at this time where we were scaling. And at that time, I think we had 30 or 40 engineers. they were the most loud social engineers you've ever met. It's like usually your engineers are these quiet people who want to be left alone. And this team of engineers, like you need a separate conference room for them because they were so loud. And what was cool about that, it was a direct reflection of the culture we wanted and the type of people we needed.
Mhm.
And so, we could look at this group and say, yeah, those engineers are different, and they're different because there are engineers. And consequently, our development processes, the way we build software, the way they do automation, the way they do QA is different than other companies because they are collaborative. Anyway, that again, the example is that you need to pick what you're going to scale within culture and then build that into the process you're building. It doesn't mean that an HR person can't come in and do engagement or learning or inclusion, but the thing that they're building has to match the business goal. And at that point in our growth stage, it wasn't about inclusion and learning and engagement, it was about growth. And so we needed to figure out how to grow and then to make sure that we were growing in a way that was consistent with the company we wanted to build.
Well, I think too, like what I've noticed is that we do employee surveys, these types of things at Secure Vision, and we also do real one-on-one conversations because you're not going to get everything from a survey. We try to breed a culture where people actually feel comfortable talking to us, and I think a big part of that is you definitely got to be receptive when people get feedback, and not only that, you actually have to implement some of the feedback so that they see the impact of their contribution. The tricky part with
100%.
that right. And the tricky part of that sometimes is that what we notice often is that some of the requests that we would receive consistently were things that we were not ready for in this stage as a business, right?
Yeah.
There was different cultural things, aspects that people wanted to do in terms of like join groups and these types of things. And we didn't have the infrastructure built to support those types of things for several reasons, right? Some of which are, just a bandwidth time perspective. Others is it's not a core competency. We don't understand different aspects of how that could impact the business. And so there was just sometimes,
or it's not a priority, or
right.
we'll get to
Yeah,
that someday. Yeah.
right. And so like sometimes the feedback was like, hey, that's a really cool idea. I think that we might be ready for that at XYZ stage when we're at this revenue number or when we're at this headcount number. That's something we should explore right now. Boom, boom, boom. And I think it's just as long as you provide that feedback versus just not really addressing it, like, yeah, we'll consider it and then not doing anything with it. It's like share it because people aren't going to necessarily, everyone in our organization is not going to necessarily have that executive perspective, right? They
So
may,
now
right.
you're pushing me towards an area of great interest of mine. One of the things that Joe did immediately, I don't know if it was first quarter you were here, it might have been the second, but it was it was one of the things you wanted to do like right away, was implement an employee survey every quarter. And like I'd love to hear you talk about why that was such a high priority, and like what goes into the survey, and then the reporting of the data back to the company has become a ceremonial. Like Joe does it every quarter, and then we have an all hands, which is almost entirely, for that all hands anyways, Joe presenting the data in a way that explains where employees are, enthused, and where there are pains and what the pains are, the magnitude, and remediation plans. Like, what are we going to do? And then the following quarter after that, the update is we did these things, and then here's the survey data. And that like is the kind of thing that like Sam and Eva and I, my two amazing co-founders, Sam and Eva, like we didn't know how to do that. And it really did matter big time.
Yeah. And to your point, one of the things is to acknowledge all the feedback. You have to make sure that people feel heard. But the other thing is to make commitments that you can actually action, and action within the time frame that you set. So part of what we do is many of these things aren't big company actions. We heard this within engineering, and engineering leadership is going to do these two things in the next 90 days. And then engineering and leadership does those two things. We come back and say, hey, how do you feel, engineers? Similarly, sales leadership is like, hey, this is the one thing we can fix this quarter for the feedback. But it's acknowledging all the feedback, but then making the commitment on the stuff that you can actually action. Because to your point,
I wonder if you could talk about like James's point is really interesting one. Like you have a very, very novel and effective way of explaining why we're not going to do this thing or that thing with respect to cultural asks. And it has a lot to do with beautiful charts. I'm not going to lie. Like, it sounds pedantic, but like most people are reasonable people when confronted with data, especially their own data that came from them, in a way, like, you just have a really compelling way to not have people be bummed out when the top two big culture investments are going to be these two and not those two.
Yeah. So it's, pretty data I think is good. And there's so many great tools that make that easier. I think what it is we need to make sure that people globally hear what everything is. And by the way, when you get those big trends where the whole company said this thing, it's actually not the whole company. Like almost any situation, it's 40% or it's under half. It's a plurality. And so while those big things that they want might be modestly consistent, saying that this is not the right time in the business is an important acknowledgement. So we've had for a couple of rounds now, we've had people asking for a 401k match. And actually earlier on, the second administration survey, people wanted a 401k, and we were able to turn that on. And then after that was on, we wanted a 401k match. And the comeback was, we hear you and we think it's important for everyone to save for their retirement. It's not something that we can do right now, but let's not forget that you have equity. And let's put together a whole talk track on the value of equity and how that helps you plan for your future. And so while we had to give them a no, because the investment was, financially not something we were able to prioritize, it doesn't mean it was a no and don't talk about it. It was a not right now, and let's talk about the vehicles you do have. And so there's this opportunity to engage in conversation. And maybe that's the point, James, that you were making up front. It's less about having the exact right answer and providing the exact thing that people ask for when they ask for it, and more about making sure that we get to have a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's just generally adopting the mindset of treat your employees as customers. They're just as important, if not more important. I mean, when we run NPS, Net Promoter Score, for our customer base, and we get a piece of feedback that is an area for improvement, I personally jump in. I reach out to the customer. This isn't some kind of automated response. It's, hey, thank you. That's really interesting. We're going to take a look at that and see if that is something we can improve on. And if it is, then, and it's not like a very one-off specific thing that just applies to one customer, right? Then it's okay, let's go. So a recent example for us is we had a customer said, hey, I love the service. I want to refer you to other people. The one thing I really don't like is how you do billing. And it was kind of random. We were like, what the F? Like, I didn't even know that was like a thing, but like something about how we were doing billing like annoyed him. And it was a chief operating officer for one of our customers. So we immediately like looked into it, and within 2 weeks we had updated the process. I shared the process document with him so he could see the new process that we built out. And I called him and had him a conversation about like, hey, really, thank you. Like, if you notice anything else, like that would be great. And it's kind of like that same level with employees. It's like, if there's something really interesting brought to the table, it's like, hey, not only are we going to, get back to the team, but maybe we should do a personal outreach real fast, right? Regardless if we can implement it or not, and just like really show appreciation for the engagement.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
I mean, all of this is like, it has a lot to do with the broad umbrella of just general transparency. Like that comes back reliably. I forget the phrasing of the question in Joe's survey every quarter, but transparency ranks among the very highest things that employees appreciate about working at Thoropass. And like from the beginning, Sam and Eva and I were like, this is a startup. Certainly back then, it's not only everyone's right to understand what's going on, it's their responsibility. And like, that's not for everyone. There's plenty of people who can't or don't want to exist in the level of ambiguity and that exist in startups, but a lot of people do. And that's the kind of people you need at a startup. So knowing the burn, knowing the headcount hiring plan, knowing, I mean, basically everything apart from everyone's salaries is fully shared. Like we don't even make unique content for internal team meetings. It's just the board stuff. It's the same materials that the leadership team puts together for the board that we share with everybody. And, you know, there are people out there for whom that it would be stressful to understand, you know, what's our burn and are we going to be able to raise more and like these kinds of things. But in our experience, the transparency is very much appreciated. So like, and a piece of the transparency thing is confronting these culture initiatives, you know, and having a conversation, to use Joe's phrasing, about asks that aren't going to be implemented right away. It's just the overall transparency umbrella, I think, is underpinning all of it.
So we have a few minutes left, and I have some very specific questions that I want our audience to be able to take away and guide strategy. So I'm not going to say like rapid fire, but I do have a few questions for you both. Joe, at this point, I think the Thoropass is it's around a 200 person company. Is that okay?
That's
So
about right.
what does your day look like, or your quarter look like? Maybe is it better? Like, how do you divide your time, and what are you prioritizing?
Yeah,
How do you think about your role?
Yeah, big question. So we talked about this a little bit. I keep a very lean team. I don't think an HR team needs to be huge to be effective, as long as we have the right tools to do what we're doing. And because of that, we have great tools and data. It allows me to focus on what I think are some more strategic things. Currently, in our current quarter, given the macroeconomic business environment, my day is focused largely on making sure we're being operationally super effective. And that means managing our headcount plan, including who we're hiring and how we're bringing them on and what those offers look like. It also means managing our internal spend, because I have operations. We have a lot of software. We have a lot of processes that need to be efficient. I really think my biggest contribution to the organization right now, we're at this stage where we're trying to continue to grow, but trying to grow in a smart way, is making sure that we're doing all the things as efficiently as we can from an HR perspective. That being said, we're not skimping on the things that our employees need. We're still providing great benefits. We're still providing learning opportunities. We're still doing great performance management. So all of these things are happening in this lens of making sure we're doing them effectively on a day-to-day basis. Because I have a small team, yesterday I did everything except hiring. I worked with compensation, I worked with performance management, I did results of a survey. And then today I'm doing some hiring stuff because there's some people in the queue that I need to interview. But as I said before, you need an HR leader who can get their arms dirty up to their elbows and pays attention to your business plan.
Yeah, I think that the key takeaway that I've been preaching lately is you need a people leader that's analytical, that knows their way around reporting and spreadsheets, right?
Yep.
And sometimes there's that disconnect, and I see a lot of LinkedIn posts where it's like, talent acquisition or people needs a seat at the leadership table. It's like, well, if you want a seat at the leadership table, you need to be able to speak their language.
Yep.
And
100%.
a lot of the times there's a disconnect. So Austin, final question before the end of the show. From a people perspective, talent acquisition, employee lifecycle journey, anything people related, what are you most involved in from a people perspective at this point of scale at 200 employees?
I mean, I wish I could say I still get on and interview everyone when we're recruiting people. I can't do that anymore. But a lot of the leadership team will pull me into different processes to help recruit all the way up and down the seniority scale, sort of ad hoc and impromptu. And that is really compatible with my style. So like I'll get to know candidates, and the leadership team knows that I like doing this. And they also, having worked with me a while now, they know which kinds of candidates I should meet and help them sort of get there on the offers. And then executives, like we have put in place, a lot of new executives in the past 6 or 9 months. And going back to part of the conversation earlier, like you can't just pull the trigger on an executive hire overnight. Like they need to meet the board. They need to spend a lot of time. They're contemplating a move away from something where it's high prestige, high pay. They want to make sure that they'll be able to succeed in a smaller org. All of that stuff. So a lot of face time with those candidates in particular. And then I think these are trying times in startup land. I generally try to align whatever activities I do with cultural initiatives that Joe is systematically trying to put in place, because like we can't stop hiring, but the most expensive thing in building teams, I think, is if you have a voluntary attrition problem. Like candidate that leaves, it's not just the loss of productivity of that one person in the time it takes to hire a backfill. It's there's a probability attached to the backfill being as good, right? You may actually take a month to replace the great engineer who left, but the replacement may not be the 10xer that you had. You got to figure that out at that point.
Yep.
So like there's knock-on effects. If you have a voluntary attrition problem, it's a bigger problem than, you know, the one person or the two people by themselves. It's this enormous time suck that comes out in the wash. So like thinking about how to retain people, which we've been very successful in doing. I don't know what the numbers are. Joe will have them, but
yeah, we're currently at 8.9% for voluntary attrition, which
Nice.
is insane
Right.
in this market.
Yeah.
Insane. We could actually do an entire episode on planning for and managing to a low voluntary attrition number. Like it impacts every part of the HR system.
Let's do it. Let's do
No,
it.
I'd love to.
I mean,
I'd love to have the conversation.
and yeah, the whole, I mean, the ROI on that is incredible. And when people leaders can actually measure that for executive teams and really show the ROI of optimizing the employee lifecycle and the talent acquisition process, structured hiring, structured onboarding, right? Everything that goes into it. It's usually in the tens of millions for most organizations, and they don't even realize it. So, well, hey, look, I know we're up on time. Austin, Joe, this has been a great episode. You're definitely welcome back whenever you want to join me again. I think that there's definitely a lot of key takeaways here that's going to guide talent strategy for a lot of folks. So thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much, Jake.
Thanks again.
For sure. And for everybody tuning in, thanks for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.